While we're waiting, I put the link in Discord. There's a pretty good, oh, wow. We're back. I'm sorry. Just continuing note from yesterday about today, welcome to this and that. And I, of course, need to edit it while I'm sitting here. Um, what we talked about yesterday, the art piece comedian, um, it's a good article on it in the New York Times. Whoever their art and money critic is, he's actually quite good and a whippersnapper, but he did write actually pretty much all the stuff I was yakking about yesterday. Not quite so theoretically, of course, but he filled in some blanks, and it's worth your reading. Not that we're going to indulge it for a second day. It included fascinations that are useful, that are exemplify or signify what late capitalism looks like. So there's this what's his name, Justin or Julian Sun, who's the owner of the $6.2 million banana and duct tape thing. It's interesting how, because he's a Bitcoin guy, that he's actually kind of interesting. I mean, he's playing the whole 6.2 million. I mean, he's trying to pay it with his own, he's made his own Bitcoin. So he's going to try and pay it with that. But I think Sotheby's only takes the more reputable forms of Bitcoin. So that alone is a kind of interesting problem. But it may be exactly what he needs to do, which would make his Bitcoin more stable in that particular context. So, you have to think in multi dimensions on these matters. All righty. It's November 22nd. Welcome to This and That. We're going to talk today a little bit about late capitalism because it came up again in a variety of literatures. Um, uh, Sorry for that little diversion there. We're going to talk a little bit about late capitalism. Came across a piece that was done just a week or so ago. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. It goes on for an hour and a half, but it has a couple of interesting folks in it. Chris O'Kane, who's written some good stuff, and as if we needed to listen to more sociologists, Stefan Lesinek, who I'm going to talk a little bit about today. He did this much longer piece, which he did with slides, which I found amusing. So I'm going to go through those slides fairly quickly. But the idea of late capitalism is important because, we need to sort of ask the question, what is late capitalism? And it's not a reference to its death necessarily, but rather the periodicity of it. That is, there could be a pre-capitalism, which there is, perhaps a high capitalism. That's an interesting question. The normal historical mode of production goes, sort of primitive, ancient, um, feudal capitalists, and you can squeeze in mercantilism and a bunch of other Asiatic despotism and a bunch of other things, but it essentially goes, the end point or the apex is, full-scale communism that replicates in many ways the kind of social relations that might have existed under primitive communism, sort of pre-conflict, um, which is kind of that utopian thing that some people are really interested in and that attracted or appealed to people in the 19th century. So late capitalism can be seen as a linear timeline period on the one hand. On the other hand, it is just simply a way of signifying, as Lesnick refers to it, as the latest capitalism as opposed to late capitalism. But let me introduce the idea with a short thing done a little while ago by David Abeles, probably, or Abeles. We live in a time of late capitalism, but what does that mean? And what's so late about it? So, there are hashtags. It's a trending meme used as a kind of shorthand to illustrate the absurdities of certain free market economies. Now, that's a very European view. Very few people refer to what we're in at the current moment in this country, anyway, in the U.S. as late capitalism. Now, there are, for instance, discussions about the populist rise in late capitalism, the increase in financial related investments in late capitalism, migration conditions in late capitalism, and so on. And you could see most of that operative in the last decade or so. This current turn towards Trumpism, as much as we wanted to see the end of that kind of weird populism, it's still around. And liberals are probably more annoyed by it. You could say that it's just, it's doing what it's doing. Not much we can do to make it recede. Kind of let it run its course. Now that raises, I think, the most important thing, and which is why I came across this much longer session by a bunch of folks on YouTube on the centenary of the 100th sort of year of Frankfurt School critical theory. And I know that sounds tedious at all, but it is, in fact, the way in which we can talk about things like populism and culture. So let me get through this Abeles piece here, and I think that'll give you a decent background. Karl Marx first analyzed the last stage of capitalism in his 3-volume magnum opus Capital, particularly in volume 3. For Marx, an acceleration in the turnover of capital, concentrating wealth in the hands of the few, would result in a continuous tendency to crises. And we've talked about this before, that, and I think other authors who are talking about this may think of this as a kind of, as Stephen above mentions, a kind of crisis of crises, continuous tendency to crisis. This, he believed, would ultimately make the system collapse. And of course, some people have tried to do it in a technical way, that is, in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't always do it. And a tendency for the rate of profit to fall could happen, probably will happen. But by the time we get through measuring it, maybe the crisis either will be over or the apocalypse will arrive. Anyway, late capitalism is coined by Werner Sombart, and a controversial guy. There's other things that are problematic in the Sombart commentary on modern capitalism. But his main contribution was to define 3 periods of the capitalist economic system: early or proto-capitalism, advanced capitalism, and late capitalism. So he's using, in the typical German sort of way, a kind of period analysis. In Sombart's analysis, late capitalism refers specifically to economic, political, and social deprivations associated with the aftermath of the First World War. And, it really is more synonymous with the contemporary. But the term wasn't taken up widely until the 70s. Belgian Marxist economist, the late Ernest Mandel's treatise, Late Capitalism, gets published in English, and a lot of folks read it. It's got a lot of good diagrams and all those sort of things. But the idea is, of course, to describe the economic expansion after the Second World War. This is a time characterized by the emergence of multinational companies, corporations, a growth in the global circulation of capital, and an increase in corporate profits and the wealth of certain individuals, chiefly in the West. We're still kind of there. Didn't represent a change in the essence of capitalism, only a new epoch. So, it's periodic in that sense. Marked by expansion and acceleration in production and exchange. Thus, one of the main features of late capitalism is the increasing amounts of capital investments into non-traditional productive areas, such as the expansion of credit, and correspondingly, the expansion of debt. So we've looked at all this. We've fiddled around, mentioned Graeber, looked at Michael Hudson, et cetera, et cetera. This period of exceptional economic growth, argued Mendel, would reach its limit by the mid-1970s. Well, he's writing in the 70s, so, this is another one of those deals, just like Marx himself, well, apocalypse around the corner, poop will hit the fan, but sorta did in 73, second wave in 79. Could happen again, but I don't think that's going to happen. The global oil industry is probably too resistant to that kind of crisis, especially since America is now taken on fracking in its most radical form. Britain was also experiencing a banking crisis derived from a fall in property prices and an increase in interest rates. However, since the time of Mendel's writing, such crises have become recurrent. Well, I think they were always recurrent in the modern or the mode of production called capitalism. There's always been crisis, some a little more global than others. Others, actually pretty extreme when you consider, the world was generally smaller, quote unquote. And so a crisis in the major financial centers was much more radical. But for instance, 1980s, known for the different regional financial crises, such as in Latin America, the US, and Japan. In 1997, there was an Asian financial crisis that included, this whole decade of Japanese problems in Japan, et cetera. And then, of course, the 2008 US subprime crisis. Now, when you look at it from a cultural point of view, the term late capitalism regained relevance in the context of, unfortunately, architectural criticism, but it was picked up in a further sort of move, partially because Fred was spending time at USC and hanging around architects. So postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, became a way of combining all those things. And that's when it arises. Drawing on Mendel's idea that capitalism has sped up and gone global, Jameson expanded his analysis to the cultural realm. His argument was that late capitalist societies have lost their connections with history and are defined by a fascination with the present. Now, if you just took that sentence to say argument, or, it's a proposition, the problem, of course, is that that's kind of what, the ahistorical present, that's modernism. So it's not postmodern at all. It's just modern. And, it's a thing you could get into arguments with people on. In Jameson's account, however, late capitalism is characterized by a globalized post-industrial economy where everything, not just material resources and products, but also immaterial dimensions, such as the arts and lifestyle activities, becomes commodified and consumable. Now, this is a value form argument, so it's not so new. It's just, it's old wine, new packages, etc. In this capitalist stage, we see innovation for the sake of innovation, a superficial projected image of self via celebrities or influencers channeled through social media and so on. In this time, whatever societal changes that emerge are quickly transformed into products for exchange. Unlike those who celebrate postmodernism as replete with irony and transgression, Jameson considers it to be a non-threatening feature of the capitalist system in contemporary societies. Let me break there for a second. And yes, I think that our little banana and duct tape thing that we've been talking about, comedian, we're still there. It's not like this is progress or advancement. This is no different than some things that Banksy has done. And, goes back to Duchamp, as I was talking about yesterday, et cetera, et cetera. So to claim that it's has a certain novelty to it is, it's interesting, but really it has all the same institutional features as work done by Duchamp, for example. And so it is problematic for all the usual reasons. It isn't an edition of three, it does have a certain value aside from the auction, markup. More recently, Jonathan Crary, in his book Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, argues our current version of 24/7 capitalism, enabled by intrusive technologies and social media, is eroding basic human needs such as sufficient sleep. It is also eliminating the useless time of reflection and contemplation. Now, you have to ask, well, if you had more of that for those poor Foxconn workers who threw themselves off the top of the building, I don't know if that, probably would help. So, and then what? Since its conception, the idea of late capitalism has chiefly referred to the latest stage of capitalist development. This last stage condition has been bestowed on almost every period following a moment of economic crisis. Oh, yeah. Global economic upheaval, such as the 2008 subprime crisis and the financial upheaval caused by the COVID pandemic, have led us to a simultaneous expansion and concentration of wealth. In other words, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, such as the ever turning gyre of capitalism. Indeed, contemporary economists such as Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz suggest increasing inequality could endanger our future. Now, this has been discussed since Marx, so this is not like that new. But will it come after late capitalism? In the face of the climate crisis, some are imagining everyday lives no longer guided by overconsumption and environmental degradation, a post-capitalist society. In the meantime, the hashtags continue. So that's kind of, the deal, what most people concern themselves with. And the point, of course, is that I was watching this thing on that was done last week, I guess. It was done the day after the election, so it's that recent. So Adorno wholeheartedly endorses Horkheimer's programmatic statement, according to which critical theory's objective is not simply to eliminate one or other abuse, for it regards such abuses as necessarily connected with the entire setup of the social structure. Although it itself emerges from the structure, its purpose is not, either in the conscious intention or in its objective significance, the better functioning of any element in the structure. On the contrary, it's suspicious of the very categories of better, useful, appropriate, productive, and valuable, as these are understood in the present order, and refuses to take them as non-scientific presuppositions about which it can do nothing. So, a programmatic statement according to which critical theory is, the objective of critical theory is to do all of that. And so it sounds paradoxical in that sense, but I suppose paradoxical in the good sense, where you're getting a sense of, viable, false consciousness, which I think really describes current populism. Anyway, Proto-Socialism and Late Capitalism is a 1979 text by Herbert Marcuse on Rudolf Barrow, who I think is a communist, a German communist, I think, as I recall. Barrow's analysis breaks through the fetishism of Marxist pseudo-orthodoxy and the counterculture of immediacy. His dialectical analysis leads to an authentic internal advance of Marxist theory informed by the comprehended reality. The radicalism of its perceptions is primarily revealed in the following key points of theory and praxis. So this is Marcuse's summary on essentially Barrow's perceptions about late capitalism. The rejection of the Marxist-Leninist model of proletarian revolution, which has long since been surpassed in advanced industrial society. That is, seizure of power by the revolutionary masses, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the elaboration of a new model corresponding to real social trends. And that is one sort of argument that you can see occurring in the 70s, that there was some sort of that enough was going on, and the crises could be analyzed in terms of late capitalism. Something else is going to happen. Like number two, a new definition of class relations, both in existing socialism and in late capitalism. The expanding working class, the proletariat as a minority in it, the integration and extension of dependency, the transformation of the working class into the people, quote unquote, and its conservatism. Number three, the key role of the intelligentsia in the transitional period corresponding to its position in the process of production, the fetishism of the masses. Number four, the shift of the focal point of the social dynamic onto subjectivity. That is the journey inwards and its ambivalence, consciousness as a revolutionary force. All this fits in, of course, with Marcuse's points. The new formulation and answer of the question of the subject of the revolution, the consequence of point two. Recall that point two is on a new definition of class relations, sort of how some people might have come to a new version of populism in that sense. Number six, the demonstration that integral socialism is a real possibility if decisive measures are implemented, that is, redistribution of work and income, gradual abolition of the performance principle, a democratic educational system, a council system, workers' council system, expanded beyond the factory. The new economy is an economy of time, progressive reduction of socially necessary labor time in the realm of freedom within the realm of necessity. Now, hopefully, if you've considered the history of the planet in the 44 some odd years since this was written, lots of trouble. There's no redistribution of work and income. We haven't abolished performance principles. We have even less, we have an anti-democratic educational system, and there is no workers' council system expanded beyond the factory. Well, a few in certain places in the world, but in America, certainly not the case. And remember that Marcuse is writing this while he's in America. So anyway, our friend here, Steve Lessenick, politics of as if, takes on this question, and Klaus Offe, Offe is a German sociologist and peculiarly interested in late capitalism. And his starting point is the idea that there's a kind of overload of problems that occur from problem-generating mechanisms and problem processing capacities in society. Late capitalist polities are confronted with contradicting functional imperatives. And that's kind of where we are: capitalism versus democracy, capital versus demos, and accumulation versus legitimation. We have all of those at work now. We could say that the last election actually brought all those even more forward. Late capitalism theory, LCT, is a political theory of double bind. That is, accumulation problems breed legitimation problems and vice versa. You can see that in the current question of propping up the economy since 2008. The fact that we haven't had a second recession yet, and kind of rolling right along, as it were, if you think about stock markets and those sort of things. But we also see that there are big problems on the horizon. Structural necessity for permanent crisis management and structural proneness to second-order crises. And in fact, that's kind of where we are, the crises of crisis management. I suppose that the recent storm, Harriet, I guess, in North Carolina is an example of the manipulation, creating a crisis of crisis management. That is, FEMA did a good job, but certain parties, i.e. Trump, framed it as a crisis, even though there was no crisis. And so continuing on, there's a historical non-evolutionary emergence of a set of three backing mechanisms. These backing mechanisms are market organization, institutionalization of technological progress, and the welfare state. And all of these things are operative still at the current moment. There's certain assumptions about technological progress. Certainly, the reason why we're still in Ukraine is some faith in technological progress. Late capitalism, in the sense of the eventual exhaustion of the political toolkit for system stabilization. In other words, we're running out of band-aids. The you know we Fortunately, well, not fortunately, we really don't know what the Trump economic management system management for government is going to look like. I mean, we sort of have this inkling about how out of control it's going to get, and of course, the intrusion of Elon. It's not going to be stable. It's going to be more unstable. Dysfunctional functionality of the accumulation-driven and welfare state-based output democracy established and institutionalized after World War II with a long-run rise in discipline and control. This is the tension between individualization, your little social media thing, and autonomy, whether you should have any autonomy on that basis. And of course, it's gotten squeezed in all kinds of places. And then, of course, social inequalities, or the tension with meritocracy, and of course, ecological destruction versus sort of neoliberal wealth creation. So that's the problem. And so he ends it kind of talking about existential problems in late capitalism. Now, remember, he's only talking for 15 minutes or half an hour. How can a structurally crisis-ridden social formation, which has reached the limits of its problem-solving capacities, deal with the supposed interruption of existential problems like climate change? You could ignore it. You could deal with it. You could make money from it. But there's a fourth element, and I think that's the important thing that late capitalist theory might actually raise. And this is, it perhaps is the thing that sociologists devolved to, but ideology. Late capitalist societies invest a plethora of institutional, that is, material and symbolic resources in the production of instrumental social knowledge about the inner systemic manageability of the climate crisis. I think we can see that, pulling out of the Paris Accords, having it run, having the COP conferences run by oil companies or oil countries that are dominated by oil, it's really fascinating, I suppose. That is interesting. So, as if, this is what his point is. 3 modes of as-ifism constituting the irrational rationality of crisis management. This is the crisis of crisis management. Number 1, repression, pretending that nothing is wrong. Number 2, rationalization, pretending that something is being done. That's like these COP conferences, and as opposed to the IPCC. And solutionism, pretending that the problems can be overcome. And we can see some of that at work. All 3 ideological strategies converge in the radicalized reproduction of the contradictions inherent to late modern capitalism. That is, and we've come back to it again, we're still in the 19th century, exploitation and externalization, alienation, and delusion. And so we're kind of right at that moment. Deleuze, Guattari, Hart and Negri, all that stuff's still there. And on the one hand, this may still be propping up a certain type of radical analysis. On the one hand, on the other hand, there's stuff's out there. It's happening. And so our friend here talks about the rise and fall of late capitalism. If there ever was a historical conjuncture in which the political toolkit for the self-stabilization of democratic capitalism happened to be exhausted, it's ours. Confronted with the existential problems, late is turning into latest capitalism. The ideological means of reproduction depleted, the material contradictions of democratic capitalism getting ever more palpable, the backing mechanism of last resort, and thus the signature of last capitalism, that is, latest, last capitalism, will be open violence and war. So eventually we're still back down to chaos. Against this backdrop, critical thinking and emancipatory action once again take on an existential significance just as they did 100 years ago. So at, we're at that moment, right? We're not quite to the first 5-year plan, but we're at that moment. What was going on in 1924 or 1920, I guess it is, they bomb Wall Street. Well, needless to say, they just arrested some guy who was trying to build an IED so he could blow up Wall Street. So the same things are happening, perhaps not as well constructed. This idiot, it just, well, anyway. And that's The Politics of As If by Stefan Lessenick. He's Anyway. The point is, the second author, a little bit more coherent on the point of he's essentially redoing a thing he'd put out in January on a blog from which this is taken, where he is trying to say, ultimately, Frankfurt School critical theory, for a variety of interesting and useful and important reasons, did detach itself from a political economy analysis and hence became, not that O'Kane says this way, but it becomes sort of less Marxist, whatever that means. And he doesn't phrase it that way, but it is this idea of sort of neglecting the critique of political economy, not kind of looking at it more seriously. And of course, the scholarship, as I've tried to point out, is changing. That is, you have this Heinrich thing on value form, but there's other stuff there, and it's necessary to take that in with understanding value form, of course, but understanding that it's, and Marx says this himself, it's more than talking about the value form. So he does a little literature review here. All of these are good links here. You should think about where all these goes. And he looks at the work of Alfred Schmidt and James Schmidt more specifically about these matters to get a inspiration and to show that, at least from a German point of view and the German relationship to the original Frankfurt School, and of course there's the move to New York during World War II, blah 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 blah. But it is he wants to assert that Marx was not abandoned, and that it is still connected, and it is still connected if you actually read it. But it's a kind of critique of Habermas in the sense that at one certain moment, it went off into this other thing, sort of. And I don't think O'Kane would call it superstructural, but it is superstructural. If you go towards Habermas, ultimately you have to go to some sort of institutional or legal or something. And those issues are kind of important to frame some of the later developments of people like Adorno. But it is a wide kind of area for research. There's a couple of folks there's some really good work being done on this now, and I think there's a revival of interest in the Frankfurt Critical School simply because there's just so much there still. And of course, it's not taught enough in various places. So it is, and at least he points out that the critique of political economy is key to Adorno's late critical theory. So as this literature also shows, rather than Pollock's theory of state capitalism rendering political economy marginal to post-war critical theory, the late work of Adorno deepened and expanded the early Horkheimer's interpretation of the relationship between the critique of political economy and the critical theory of society in two ways. Number one, further developing the interpretation of the critique of political economy as a theory of social constitution and the social domination of capital accumulation. That's kind of where we are right now. And you can see some of the extensions to it. That's what I was talking before about structure and agency and structuration and all that other jazz. Number two, continuing to extend the critique of political economy into a critical theory of society, which is kind of O'Kane's sort of deal. In further contrast to Schurman, the modifications to capital society that Adorno's social theory incorporated in his critique of late capitalism as a negative totality were not conceived of as overcoming capitalism's economic contradictions, but as counteracting tendencies that were derived from the inherent contradictions and antagonisms and crisis tendencies of capital accumulation. So this is a matter of scale. It's a matter of emphasis and focus. It is, of course, a demand to ask kind of empirical questions. Now, in the second place, there's there's a wealth of work in political economy, and that builds on this conception of Frankfurt School political economy as opposed to critical theory. And so stuff happens. There's stuff. A lot of people writing on this stuff. Some interesting people. Frederick Harry Pitts, I think, writes actually about political economy of art, which I find quite amusing. And anyway, so there are critiques of economics and social science methodology, capitalist state, blah, 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 all of those darn things. And so it's a brief little blog post by Chris O'Kane on this. O'Kane has written some other much longer things on Frankfurt School stuff, but he's always coming at it from a political economy perspective. So there's a little video I put in here. It's 90 minutes, and don't make yourself crazy listening to it. If you're amused by it, certainly speed it up and stop. Whatever. This is the link to Chris O'Kane's article and narrative. There's a little counter thing that Lesnick writes here that I probably should end on. This is the last paragraph. A counter-narrative of democracy as a dialectical process, which corrects, or at least contrasts with, the common self-interpretations in or of society, aims to shed light on the contradictoriness which has been inherent in modern democracy from the outset. In so doing, it strives to place an emphasis on the structural conflict proneness of democratic development, which is anything but coincidental. The focus selected here reveals the downsides of the rich democracies, while the poor relatives of prosperous Western democracies take the limelight. Moreover, it underscores the fact that democracy is more than just a form of government. Democracy, complete with all its social preconditions and implications, is a type of society, a social way of life, just as Alexis de Tocqueville, the great classical pioneer of the sociological conception of democracy, established this as long ago as the 1830s with regard to America, that is U.S.-American democracy. Its key element, and this is another of Tocqueville's lasting insights, is the principle of equality, the concept of equal living conditions for all. This conception is the starting point for this essay. Democracy, in a preliminary definition, is understood as the equal right of all citizens to partake in the collective shaping of the social circumstances which affect them all equally. Equal participation in the political configuration of one's own life circumstances. What may appear as merely formal notion of democracy at first glance, in fact, truly gets to the heart of the matter. And I think that's kind of where it is at the present moment, is, these problems of what counts as democracy. And of course, people who don't even want to talk about big D or little d democracy at all. So that's my little deal here. Let me see if there are questions, comments, brickbats at all. Our capacity for hypocrisy and irony, indeed we have that. It is, yes, I agree, Larry. We've been entered the clown capitalism phase. More reputable, but not quite reputable. Yeah. I agree with all of those things. I think it's just useful to look at, as we have more recently, like with that little film noir about the circus or the carnival or the sideshow. I think those are still quite viable and important. And not simply because that is sort of a self-enclosed little noir narrative, but the fact is it does reflect on our capacity to be interested in spectacle. And I didn't make the comment in the session we did after that film, but it just seems to me that we're doing the same thing. So, for example, if you watch cable television, unfortunately I do, but I'm going to detach myself from it very soon. They have, under the pretext of calling it learning, they have, with all due respect, freak shows. That is, in fact, it was very popular about a year or so ago. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Botched, where failed plastic surgeries are shown and talked about, and they are as grotesque as I mean, just looking at them in a more anonymous sort of way, but it is pretty much no different than P.T. Barnum. So we got geeks. We even put one in the White House. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say today. What's our right, I ended on time. So I'm going to stop sharing and since there's no big outcry, I'm going to get us off live stream.